Right. Yes, so, I mean, I would be thrilled if there is a Max Planck Institute for Theoretical Biology. Unfortunately, it's only for evolutionary biology, but I hope you can hear me well. Right, so my name is Chaitanya, and I'm trying to follow up like a very big concept from over there, but trying to condense it down to something for theoretical biology and agriculture. So let me first go ahead by just mentioning what I mean by theoretical biology, because it might not be very clear to everyone in this audience, because it somehow might seem quite far away, because we have heard a bit about models, right? So what we try to do in theoretical biology is definitely do come up with models, but one of the fundamental things that we want to understand, at least in my group, is to develop theories to understand these processes which are common across scales in which living systems are involved. Right? And then try to, if possible, wherever it is possible, to develop some translational applications. And let me just mention what I mean by that. So by fundamental studies, we try to look at all the way from the abstract models, from the origins of life, all the way to societal developments, like how do societies behave and concepts work in social evolution. But then at some point, you can also translate this understanding into actual applications. For example, we have been working in Darwinian medicine, Darwinian agriculture, and then trying to push a bit more into conservation and policy making. And that only happens exactly as you mentioned, by working across fields and working together with the people from who have different expertise than in these different fields. While we are doing this, of course, we want to maintain a healthy toolbox, because as you go across these scales of organization, which are massive, for each of these different systems, one needs to have a different tool to use. And yeah, we try to focus on a few of these tools, but then we keep to use one or drop one, depending on what one needs, right, for the relevant question at hand. And the question that we would like to focus on over here, as we all are doing, is sustainable agriculture. And I know that I'm going to be preaching to the choir here. You know everything about the problems that we have in achieving sustainable agriculture, because what we want to achieve is pretty broad, right? We want to have profits for the farmers, because otherwise that's not societally correct. So we need it to be societally sustainable as well. But at the same point, it also needs to be ecologically and evolutionarily sustainable. And I'll come to what I mean by that actually in a bit. And this is exactly what I mean. Like you know this far better than I do, that we are using like half of the habitable land just for agriculture. And the impact that it has actually on the environment is massive. It goes all the way across greenhouse gases, as we heard, to the biodiversity of animals that we see, which is mostly driven by the livestock that we have. So the impact is undeniable, but then how do we work towards yet doubling the output that we need? Because yes, the population growth is slowing down actually of the world, but it's still estimated that it will reach its peak by 2080. And this is a much more immediate problem then, right? If we want to still double the yields, and we already saw that the burden is way too high. So how do we actually manage to do that? Well, it is a complex problem. You have economics involved, you have ecology, you have evolution. I'll mention why evolution as well. But if it's such a complex problem, how do we deal with it, right? Like, I come from doing mostly theory. Theoretical biology takes a lot of inspiration, let's say, from theoretical physics as well, where you simplify everything down to maybe something which doesn't even make sense at some point, which is, trust me, this works. You try to do something like this, and you estimate that, okay, this is a perfectly round cow, and now we can do something with it. Is this correct? No, definitely not. This is wrong. But the point of this is, if you make enough models which are wrong in different ways, then maybe you learn something more about the system that we are interested in, and in a fundamental manner. And that's the idea of these theoretical biological projects in sustainability, especially for agriculture. And let me give you like a small example of how this can be actually useful, right? I mean, is this kind of theory actually even useful for doing translational research then, in a way? Well, I mean, I would just put forth this quantity, and I think in the last 5-6 years, everyone, like epidemiologists, have been calculating this R0 for centuries, but all the way from epidemiologists to politicians, everyone was calculating R0s in the last few years. And that's because, and this quantity comes from an extremely simplified mathematical model, right, which makes a lot of simplifying assumptions, but it is still useful for us. all the way towards policymaking. And yeah, that's what I would say, that there is some value, let's say, in trying to do some theoretical biology. And I would just give you three short examples of how we can leverage it for actually sustainable agriculture, which I was very happy to hear about crop rotations already, which was mentioned before. And let me just start with that, in which how you can connect something which is known as the Parrondo's paradox to crop rotations. And Parrondo's paradox, again, coming from very fundamental concepts such as a Brownian ratchet. That's where it comes from. And the idea is, let me just put it directly in terms of agriculture, where now this is what I mean by making the cow a perfect sphere. You can just think of cover crops and cash crops. Cover crops increase the soil quality, and cash crops, well, they decrease the soil quality. You can sell them, make some profit, right? Well, you can also sell the cover crops, maybe with some probability, because you can have cover crops like cloves or so, which you can make some profit. You can let farm animals graze on it, that gives you some profit. This is say a probability of 0.4. You can make some profit out of it, right? But for cash crops, it's important that you check what the soil quality is. If the soil quality is above some threshold, then maybe you get some profit. But if it is below, maybe you don't make any profit, right? That's the probability of making a profit, 0, because your soil is not even good enough to grow the cash crop. Well, if it is good enough, you get some profit out of it, which is quite high, let's say. Well, it's not 100%, but so it's high enough. And that's kind of like the two simple scenarios where we have simplified a lot of things out, right? But this is how it looks like, right? So what's the frequency of cover crops? If it's 100% cover crops, then yeah, that should be cover crops. Yeah, that's right. So you make some profit, right? At least this 0.4. It's not even half. Right? So you're not even making profit which you would make by chance. It's less than that. It's less than 50%. If you put all cash crops, which would be frequency of cover crop 0, then you're making no profit. Because in the long run, the cash crops just deplete the soil quality, and there is no future in the long run if you're not planting any cash crops, any cover crops in between. So the profit is basically just 0. Now, those two are the ones what we call as the two losing games. So you lose if you play both of these games for a very long time, right? Only cash crops or only cover crops. Interesting things happen if you mix those two, right? And this is something that we do know. If you mix them in the right proportions, actually the probability of making a profit is more than by chance. This is an extremely simple model which actually comes from Harmer and Abbott kind of advertised it. It's called Parrondo's paradox, pushed by Juan Parrondo. And it's a idea which comes from Brownian ratchets. Extremely simple physical properties. And what this shows that if you have two losing games, you can just mix those two losing games, but you have to find the right proportion of mixing those two games. And that would mean we would need to know what is the right proportion of mixing cash crops and cover crops, so that we make, on an average, a profit in the long run. Now, those different lines that you see, well, they are not going all the way always above 0.5, right? And that's because what we also tried in this kind of work was like what happens if you include pathogens into the field, because you have crop pests, and crop pests make sure that you can't make actually a profit for that long. So how do we deal with that? That brings me to the second part, which is including classical theoretical ecology, Lotka-Volterra dynamics, and somehow connecting that to pest management. So now we include crop rotations and pest management into one single model. Again, looking at a simple scenario where you have soil quality, let's say on this y-axis, which increases when you put a cover crop, and so it decreases when you put a cash crop, right? The cash crop just uses it out, and so it goes down. But we also connect it to some kind of a cash yield. Maybe you don't make, here in this case, any profit when you plant a cover crop, but you get the profit when you have the cash crop. Extremely simple model, and on top what you see is a rotation pattern, right? That's the rotation pattern we would like to calculate in the end. So we went through the whole steps of calculating the optimal rotation patterns, all and everything, and what we want to connect it to is including these plant pathogen dynamics, and are those sequences that we calculated actually sustainable? And what we mean by sustainable is it in the long run, because what we want it to last for long, right? So in this case, for example, you can see you can go for 30 years, and you're getting quite a good cash yield in the end. The thing is, like, the cash yield increases every 10 years because the sequence is a periodic sequence of 10 years. So you can use the same sequence again and again and again. But the rate of increase of cash profit is actually decreasing. So you're not making the same profit every 10 years. And the reason for that is in the second plot, is because, okay, you see there is a slight brown line at the bottom, right? Which keeps on coming up, but then it goes down again. That's the pathogen. So the cover crops are good at keeping the pathogen down, but only for so long. And that's because, we come to the last plot, is because we include pathogen evolution. Because nature is not going to stay constant, again, as we all know, from the last few years. It is going to increase in virulence. So if the pathogen increases in virulence and adapts to the plant, at some point, at the end of 30 years, you can see the exponential growth again. So the pathogen will come back up. So there is some kind of sustainability in this kind of sequence, but still not for super long, right? So including pathogen evolution actually still breaks down the concept of long-term sustainability in this case, even for sequences for cash and cover crops. Which brings me to the last project, which was at least to demonstrate the idea, which comes from branching processes, which is like a classical mathematical process that one uses to calculate if things are going to increase forever or they are going to go extinct. You can write down very nice probabilities and times for extinction and things like that. But how do we connect it to something that we are interested in this case, which is perennial weed control and herbicide resistance evolution? So we came up with a very nice mathematical model based on those branching processes. But then we realized, okay, and this was focusing on Johnson grass, and what kind of control measures do we use to control this weed of Johnson grass? Well, typically people use a lot of herbicide, which we want to reduce, or there is a lot of tillage, again, what we mentioned, what we heard before, which we would prefer to reduce. So there is a high chance of failure of these control measures. And one of the big reasons for the failure is actually herbicide resistance evolution. Because we are dumping so much herbicide in there, at some point the plants are also getting resistant to the herbicide which is being dumped. And from all these studies, what we kind of see is that then is it even possible actually to control this kind of an evolutionary potential which exists in nature by default, right? And we are trying to kind of combat it with the brute force of, say, monocultures or other dumping heavy pesticides and stuff. So are there methods? Yes, I mean, there are clearly methods. Again, we have heard them throughout, which are about, say, for example, genetic control strategies or integrated pest management, where you can mix different kind of control methods like biocontrol together with tillage, and that might actually improve the adaptation of such kind of ideas, right? Because then you can demonstrate in the lab or in the field trials that, look, this might be possible of at least reducing the evolutionary potential or controlling it in the short term as far as we can see. But the problem is, when you propose these kind of ideas, there is some kind of hesitancy, right? I mean, the amount of, the number of countries which are actually, say, for example, okay with having these genetically modified crops with increased resilience to be adopted. It's not very, say, immediately perceivable that, okay, this is going to work throughout, right? Most of the countries have not even made a decision about what they want to do with it. So this actually goes back to the question of resistance, but not in biology, but also social resistance, because the resistance is not just in these biological contexts of herbicide resistance or pathogen resistance evolution, but we are also very immune to changing our behaviors. And it takes time to adapt to, say, to new ideas or something, which, again, I would give an example of the adoption of these new rules, which everyone had to be somehow comply with for the pandemic. But it took there was clearly resistance in many places. So resistance to the adoption of new concepts, and that's actually something we tried to look at this problem again, and then you realize, okay, because this is not just in isolation, right? So this evolves in a social system. And that's one of the nice things about the different kinds of wrong models that we do. Because at some point, you can put these wrong models together in the right way to connect different things like epidemiology, economics, and evolution, which you see at the bottom. And then hopefully that gives you some kind of a better picture of what we would need to do when you integrate all these different aspects, which is then possible by mixing together these slightly simpler models. But that also brings me to the power of theoretical biology. As I mentioned, we can go across scales. And if we are looking at social systems, then we have to look at the right side, right, of this spectrum. And at the right side of the spectrum live all these kind of weird things. So we try to ask the question, like, what is the common thing between all these kind of weird things? And what is that there is a power of belief in here. All the concepts which are listed above, they exist because we choose to believe them in a social manner. They are social narratives, and their social narratives are very powerful driving force for people to come together and do something together, which exactly what we see, for example, in this room, right? That's what's happening. But narratives, they act as powerful coordination devices, and while they can bring people together to achieve these common things, they don't need to say anything about what exactly those narratives are. So what we again showed together working with cultural psychologists is that if you provide people a good narrative, then actually they will give up their selfish beliefs and actually can come together and trust each other to get something done together. And this was motivated by one of the very nice quotes by Daniel Kahneman, that no one made ever a decision because you give them a number. I mean, we have seen that before. You provide a lot of data to people. That might not be enough, so you provide a point, that's not telling people anything. How you get to that point, what's the story behind it, that's the thing that motivates. And this has been actually seen in, for example, climate mitigation problems. So, for example, if you want to win the popular imagination, you change the game, we need to tell new stories. You need to convince people that the new methods, for example, or the new techniques that we want to push are not just like, okay, here's the data that we show, that's why it will work. No, there is a deeper motivation behind it, and that would make it work. For example, that has also been shown for fisheries, that if you adopt this kind of a scenario, how the world will look like in the next 60 years. That's something that provides a much more positive, motivational story for people to adopt it, which is extremely necessary, I think. So what I would like to propose at the end over here is that when you look at agriculture, you can think of it as what Socrates put. It's like the best thing ever that happened to mankind. Or then, as we know a bit now later on, that of course it came with a lot of problems as well for the human species, with diseases and perdition. But whatever it is, agriculture definitely acts as a coordination device. And it is a persuasive technology. It changes our behaviors subtly. But now we see the effects quite drastically, but it has changed our behaviors over millennia. So we need to treat it as such and then use it as a psychological tool as well. Only then we will be able to drive this change. So with this, actually, I would like to say that achieving sustainable agriculture is a multi-scale issue, which I hope you all already know. That's not a surprise. But the thing is that the theoretical biology is also scale-free. We can go across these scales. And that's the nice thing about doing theoretical biology, and it can contribute a bit. And we can use it to promote more sustainable practices then. I would like to thank the program organizers. There was a lot of organizing thing, which I discussed a bit before, and my wonderful collaborators and funding. So thanks a lot.